White girl wears a fuck black people shirt in court. The black judge's verdict left her screaming. Chelsea McBride had never been in the back of a police car before, at least, not in handcuffs. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in the darkened windows, illuminating her furious, disbelieving face as she thrashed against the cold steel biting into her wrists. Her long blonde hair, usually immaculate, was tangled from the scuffle at the gas station. Her breath reeked of alcohol, her pulse hammering in her ears. But the overwhelming sensation consuming her wasn't fear. It was rage. "This is bullshit," she spat, kicking at the seat in front of her, her voice a slurred mess of entitlement and fury. "Do you even know who my father is?" The officer driving the car didn't respond. He didn't have to. The weight of the situation was settling in, pressing down on her like a vice. But Chelsea refused to acknowledge it. Her father wouldn't let this happen. He never did. Even now, as the events of the past hour replayed in her mind, it didn't seem real. It had started with a drunken impulse like most of her worst decisions. The night had been a blur of neon lights, overpriced cocktails, and the kind of reckless abandon that only came with the knowledge that there would be no consequences. Chelsea McBride didn't get in trouble. Not real trouble. She had been arrested before, sure, but it never lasted. A well-placed phone call, a firm handshake, and suddenly the charges disappeared. Tonight was supposed to be no different. She hadn't even noticed Denise Johnson at first. The gas station had been mostly empty, just another late-night stop before heading home. But then she'd caught Denise looking at her just a glance, nothing more. And for some reason, in her alcohol-clouded mind, that had been enough. "What the fuck are you looking at?" Denise hadn't even reacted at first, which only made Chelsea angrier. She had stepped closer, invading Denise's space, her words growing sharper, louder, slurred by the whiskey burning in her throat. "Think you're better than me?" Chelsea had sneered, the venom in her voice thick. "Think you can just stand there and judge me?" Denise had exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "You're drunk. Walk away." It wasn't the words that set Chelsea off, it was the tone. Calm, dismissive, like Denise wasn't even considering her a threat. That simple act of indifference had ignited something ugly inside her. Before she even realized what she was doing, her hands shot out, shoving Denise hard in the shoulder. The tension in the air had snapped like a live wire. Denise had stumbled but hadn't fallen. Instead, she had held her ground. Her jaw clenched, her eyes narrowed, and for the first time that night, Chelsea felt something foreign creep into her drunken haze. Doubt, but it was too late to back down now. "Come on, hit me," Chelsea had taunted, a twisted grin pulling at her lips. "I fucking dare you." For a moment, Denise had just stood there, her hands balled into fists at her sides, her breath measured. Then finally she spoke. "You're not worth it." The dismissal sent Chelsea into a blind fury. Her fist lashed out, fast and wild, connecting with Denise's jaw. The impact sent a sharp pain up her arm, but she barely felt it. The rush of adrenaline, the satisfaction of landing a blow, drowned out everything else. For a split second, the world seemed frozen. Then Denise's head snapped back into place, and Chelsea barely had time to register what was happening before Denise struck back. The counterpunch was swift, controlled not a brawl, but a calculated response. Chelsea stumbled back, shocked, furious. No one hit her, no one fought back. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Then came the sirens. Chelsea had expected them to drag Denise away, expected the cops to take one look at her blonde, rich, important, and know who the real victim was. But instead, they had handcuffed her. The realization hit like a slap to the face. But even now, sitting in the back of the squad car, Chelsea refused to accept it. They had to be making a mistake. Her father would fix this. He always did. Chelsea had never faced consequences, not real ones, the kind that left a permanent mark, the kind that changed lives. Born into privilege, raised in the comfortable bubble of wealth and influence, she moved through life with an effortless arrogance, secure in the knowledge that she would always land on her feet. Her father, a former police chief, had smoothed over her indiscretions too many times to count underage drinking, reckless driving, a shoplifting incident that would have been a criminal charge for anyone else. Her uncle, a powerful judge, made sure that when her name appeared on any police report, it vanished just as quickly. Chelsea lived with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. But tonight, everything was about to change. The squad car pulled up to the station, and as the officers dragged her out, the flashes of camera phones illuminated the night. People were recording. People were watching. She barely heard what the officers were saying as they led her inside, her mind still reeling. None of this made sense. This wasn't how it worked. This wasn't her reality. A cold realization slithered through her stomach. This was happening, and for the first time in her life, Chelsea had no way to stop it. As they led her through booking, past the rows of holding cells filled with women who didn't look like her, who didn't have the luxury of assuming they'd be bailed out before morning, Chelsea felt something she hadn't felt in years. Panic, the fingerprinting, the mugshot, the confiscation of her belongings, all of it blurred together in a whirlwind of disbelief. By the time she was shoved into a holding cell, the last traces of alcohol had begun to wear off, leaving her with a splitting headache and a sickening realization. She reached for the phone on the wall, her fingers trembling as she dialed the one number she knew would save her. It rang once, twice. Then her father's voice came through, low and heavy. "Chelsea," relief flooded her. "Dad, listen, this is bullshit. You need to get me out of here. They arrested me over nothing. Denise Johnson. I know who she is." The way he said it made something tighten in her chest. "Dad, come on," she pressed. "Fix this. You always fix this." A long pause, then finally his voice, quieter this time. "Not this time, Chelsea." The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering against the wall as the finality of those words settled over her like a death sentence. For the first time, Chelsea McBride was truly, utterly alone. Chelsea sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, arms crossed over her chest, her jaw tight with anger. The humiliation of being arrested, of being treated like some common criminal, gnawed at her like a persistent itch she couldn't scratch. She had spent the night in this disgusting cage, surrounded by people she would never associate with, her privileged world crashing down around her. But none of it mattered, not really, because she knew this was temporary. Her father would pull some strings, her uncle would make a few calls, and by this time tomorrow she'd be sipping a mimosa at brunch, laughing about this ridiculous overreaction. Still, something about the way the officers had looked at her, the way they had barely acknowledged her protests, unsettled her. They weren't supposed to treat her like this. They were supposed to respect who she was. Then she heard the name, Malcolm Graves, the judge assigned to her case. Chelsea's lips curled in disdain. A black judge. Not just any judge, a notoriously strict, no-nonsense hardliner. She had heard of him before, seen his name in articles about how he had no tolerance for disrespect in his courtroom. The media painted him as a fair and tough judge. But Chelsea knew exactly what that meant. It meant he'd love the chance to make an example out of her. A McBride. That thought alone sent a fresh wave of fury rolling through her. Who did this man think he was? Some self-righteous savior of the oppressed? Some moral authority who thought he could punish her, like she was one of the criminals he usually dealt with? She wouldn't let that happen. If they wanted a spectacle, she would give them one. Chelsea leaned back against the wall, smirking to herself as an idea began to form a bold, reckless, spectacularly defiant idea. If Malcolm Graves wanted to treat her like some insignificant nobody, she would remind him exactly who he was dealing with. By morning, when they allowed her to make a phone call, she didn't call her father. Not yet. Instead, she called Trevor. "Babe, I need you to do something for me," she purred, her voice sickly sweet despite the steel underneath. Trevor wasn't the brightest, but he was loyal to a fault. And most importantly, he never questioned her. She gave him clear instructions. Bring her a white t-shirt, plain, no logos, and a Sharpie. Trevor hesitated, probably confused, but she had no patience for his slow thinking. "Just do it," she snapped before hanging up. By the time she was released on bail the next morning, Trevor was waiting outside the precinct, a sheepish look on his face as he handed her the bag. "What's this for?" he asked, scratching the back of his neck. Chelsea didn't answer. She just yanked the Sharpie from the bag and, with slow, deliberate strokes, began writing across the front of the plain white shirt. When she was finished, she held it up, admiring her work. Bold, unapologetic, designed for maximum impact. FCK, Black People. Trevor's eyes widened. Jesus, Chelsea. Relax, she smirked, rolling her eyes. It's just words. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but thought better of it. He knew better than to challenge her when she was like this. Chelsea pulled off her designer blouse and slipped the shirt over her head, smoothing it down with satisfaction. She wanted cameras on her. She wanted gasps. She wanted Malcolm Graves to seethe in his seat. This wasn't just about making a statement. It was about proving a point. She was untouchable. They could throw her in a cell, slap cuffs on her wrists, treat her like garbage for a night, but they would never control her. Let's see how a black judge handles this, she thought, her smirk widening as she walked toward the courthouse. The moment Chelsea McBride stepped through the courtroom doors, the air shifted. A ripple of tension spread through the crowd like a shock wave, thick and suffocating, pressing down on every person in the room. It was the kind of silence that wasn't just an absence of noise, it was a vacuum, a void, an unbearable weight. The world seemed to hold its breath. Every pair of eyes snapped toward her. The jurors, the audience, the lawyers, all frozen in place. A black bailiff standing near the entrance tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster, his jaw tightening as he read the words emblazoned across her chest. His nostrils flared, his fingers curling into a fist before he forced himself to exhale. On the other side of the room, a woman sitting in the gallery clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. A murmur swept through the audience, hushed but electric, like a distant rumble of thunder before the storm broke. Phones were raised, cameras clicking, the artificial glow of screens illuminating the stunned faces of those recording history in real time. And there in the front row, Denise Johnson sat with her back rigid, her breath shallow, her dark eyes locked onto Chelsea's with an expression that wasn't just shock. It was disbelief. It was the look of someone who had seen cruelty in many forms, but never quite like this. Chelsea saw it and smiled. She loved this. The attention, the reaction, the barely contained outrage vibrating in the air. It was exactly what she wanted. The way they were all looking at her, horrified, furious, speechless, was the reason she had done it in the first place. Her gaze finally landed on Judge Malcolm Graves. He hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't even shifted in his seat, but Chelsea could see it. The barely concealed fire smoldering beneath his cold, calculating gaze. For a long, excruciating moment, he simply studied her. Not like a person, like a specimen under a microscope, a disease spreading before his eyes. Then slowly, with a deliberate precision that made every movement feel lethal, he removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the bench before him. His fingers steepled together, his expression remaining unreadable, but his eyes burned. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady. "Miss McBride." 2 words, but they rang through the courtroom like a gunshot. Chelsea tilted her chin upward, her smirk widening. "Approach the bench." The murmurs grew louder. Someone in the back let out a soft gasp. A legal assistant sitting near the prosecutor dropped her pen, the small clatter unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. Chelsea didn't hesitate. She walked forward with the same careless confidence that had carried her through life, her every step echoing against the polished floor. Her designer heels clicked like the ticking of a bomb. She reached the defense table and leaned against it casually, as if this were all a minor inconvenience, as if she were about to order a drink at a bar instead of standing trial for a crime. Judge Graves studied her again, the silence stretching unbearably long. Then finally he spoke. "Would you like to explain yourself, Miss McBride?" Chelsea arched a brow, lips curling. "Explain what exactly?" She gestured toward her chest, as if the words scrawled across her shirt were nothing more than a joke at a college frat party. The judge's expression remained impassive. "Your choice of attire." Chelsea exhaled dramatically, rolling her eyes. "It's just a shirt." Judge Graves didn't react. His voice remained calm, measured, deadly. "Then explain why you chose to wear it in my courtroom." Chelsea's smirk sharpened. "Oh, I don't know," she drawled. "Ever heard of the First Amendment?" A sharp, collective intake of breath. The boldness of the statement, The sheer audacity. Chelsea reclined against the table, folding her arms over her chest, her fingers tapping lazily against her forearm. Freedom of speech, Your Honor. Ring any bells? Something shifted in Judge Graves' expression. Not anger, not outrage, something colder. He leaned forward slightly, his hands still clasped together. I see. Chelsea McBride stood at the defendant's table, her smirk flickering ever so slightly as she waited. Waited for what she knew was coming. She had won. She could feel it in her bones. This was a joke, a show trial, a desperate attempt to make an example out of her, but it wouldn't work. It never did. She had sat through the whole proceeding with an air of bored amusement, arms crossed, rolling her eyes as the prosecutor droned on about community impact and reprehensible behavior. None of it mattered. Not the footage of the gas station fight. Not the testimonies. Not even Denise Johnson sitting in the front row, her face an unreadable mask. The verdict was inevitable. She would get probation, maybe a bullshit community service order, some joke of a sentence where she'd have to pick up trash in a neon vest, pretending to be sorry for the cameras. But jail, please. That wasn't how the world worked for people like her. She glanced at Judge Malcolm Graves, waiting for him to say the words she had already prepared to shrug off. Miss McBride, it is the decision of this court that you be sentenced to. Her lips curled. 6 months of probation and 200 hours of community service. There it was. She nearly laughed. The tension in the room seemed to break. Her attorney let out a small breath of relief. The reporters scribbled in their notebooks, some disappointed, some nodding as if they had seen it coming. Chelsea was already planning her exit. She'd flash the cameras a smug little smile, step out into the sunlight, and let her father's legal team squash any lasting damage. But then Judge Graves spoke again. However, the word cut through the courtroom like a scalpel, sharp and precise. Chelsea's stomach twisted. Your behavior in this courtroom has demonstrated a complete and utter disregard for the gravity of the situation. Your actions show not only a lack of remorse, but an outright contempt for this court, for the legal process, and for the very concept of justice. His voice was steady, measured, but Chelsea felt it like a hammer against her ribs. The murmur in the audience grew louder, whispers crawling through the rows of seats. Chelsea's pulse spiked. This wasn't part of the script. In light of your attitude today, I am modifying your sentence. A pause. You will serve 90 days in county jail, effective immediately. No bail, no early release. For a moment, Chelsea couldn't process it. The words hit her like a blow, but the pain didn't register right away, only a dull, creeping sense of wrongness. Then, the explosion. The courtroom erupted. A collective gasp, then a wave of voices crashing over one another. Reporters shot out of their seats, scrambling for their phones. The audience broke into chaos, some stunned, some murmuring in agreement, some grinning as if they had just witnessed history. Her attorney's chair scraped against the floor as he bolted upright. Your Honor, I must object. Chelsea's body locked up. Her breath caught in her throat. And then it hit her. No! The word ripped from her throat before she could stop it. No, 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 you can't do this. She stumbled forward, hands gripping the edge of the defendant's table. Her vision blurred with rage. This isn't fair. Judge Graves didn't flinch. Bailiff, he said, his voice even. Absolute. A towering black officer stepped forward. Chelsea's breath hitched. No, you don't get it. This isn't how it works. Panic clawed at her chest, wrapping tight around her ribs. Her father, her uncle, the power they wielded. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen, but Graves was unmoved. Miss McBride, you will be taken into custody immediately. If you continue to disrupt this court, I will add contempt charges to your record. She shook her head wildly, her breath coming in sharp gasps. You can't. My father will fix this. She spun to her lawyer, expecting him to do something, anything, but for the first time she saw it. The defeat in his eyes, the understanding. This was happening. The bailiff reached for her arm. Chelsea screamed, "Don't touch me!" She lashed out, yanking away, knocking over a stack of legal documents in the process, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. A second bailiff stepped in. Cold steel clamped around her wrists, handcuffs. For the second time in 48 hours, Chelsea McBride was shackled like a common criminal. She twisted, struggled, her mind spiraling. "This isn't fair," she shrieked. "I didn't do anything wrong." The cameras flashed. The reporters scribbled. The world watched. Denise Johnson, still seated in the front row, exhaled. Not in victory, not in satisfaction, just relief. Judge Graves tapped his gavel once. Next case. And just like that, Chelsea McBride's world ended. Chelsea kicked and screamed, thrashing against the iron grip of the bailiffs as they dragged her through the corridor. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the reality of what had just happened slammed into her like a freight train. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted her name, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the laughter, the whispers, the satisfaction of those who had wanted to see her fall. "This isn't over," she shrieked, her voice raw with desperation. "You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am?" The officers didn't react. They had seen this before. Rich girl, spoiled, screaming because, for the first time in her life, there was no one coming to save her. Chelsea's mind raced, her pulse hammering against her ribs as they shoved her into a holding cell. The door slamming shut with a finality that made her stomach drop. The room was small, suffocating gray walls, a metal bench, a stench of sweat and disinfectant that made her gag. No, no, no. This wasn't real. This was a bad dream, a nightmare. Any second now, the phone would ring, a guard would come in and unlock the door, and this whole thing would be erased. Her father would fix it. He always fixed it. She stumbled toward the payphone mounted on the wall, her hands trembling as she picked up the receiver and punched in the only number that mattered. It rang. Once. Twice. Then finally Chelsea. Relief flooded her, hot and overwhelming, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. "Dad, thank God. Listen, they're trying to put me in jail. Can you believe this? You have to do something. Call the DA. Call the governor. I don't care, just get me out of here." A long silence, then a sigh, a slow, heavy exhale that sent an icy shiver down Chelsea's spine. "I can't help you this time, Chelsea." The words knocked the air from her lungs. She blinked. Her mind rejected them. "What?" "No, Dad, you don't understand. You always fix things. You always—" "Not this time." The weight of those 3 words crushed her. Chelsea shook her head violently, gripping the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. "You're my father. You can't just leave me here." "I warned you." His voice was low, tired. "I told you to stop, to think. But you never listened, Chelsea. Dad, please. Goodbye, Chelsea." The line went dead. The dial tone screamed in her ear. But nothing was louder than the silence inside her. For the first time in her life, Chelsea McBride was truly, utterly alone. As the prison gates slammed shut behind her, Chelsea felt the last remnants of her old life disintegrate. The cameras were gone. The reporters had moved on. The world outside no longer cared. Now there was only this place, and in here she wasn't Chelsea McBride, the privileged daughter of a powerful man. She was fresh meat, and the wolves were waiting. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and something stale, something rotten. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie, sickly glow over the cracked concrete walls. Rows of bunk beds lined the space, occupied by women who didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't bother to hide the way they sized her up. She felt the weight of their stares, sharp and calculating. Chelsea lifted her chin, forcing herself to walk with confidence, with defiance, but every instinct inside her screamed run. A guard shoved her forward. "Welcome home, sweetheart." His voice dripped with mockery. The clang of the cell door slamming shut behind her felt like the final nail in her coffin. She barely had time to set her mattress down before she heard the footsteps. Slow, measured, predatory, a shadow loomed over her. Chelsea turned, heart hammering, and came face to face with a woman who looked like she had been carved out of stone-broad shoulders, muscular arms covered in ink, a jagged scar running down her cheek. She grinned. "You're the rich bitch." It wasn't a question. Chelsea's spine stiffened. She wasn't about to let some prison thug intimidate her. "Who's asking?" A fist came out of nowhere. The punch landed hard, knocking Chelsea back into the wall, her skull slamming against concrete. Pain exploded behind her eyes, a blinding, nauseating wave that made the world spin. Then came the second blow, and the third. Hands grabbed at her like hungry wolves descending on fresh meat. Her hair was yanked back, sharp nails clawing at her arms, her stomach. A knee drove into her ribs, stealing the air from her lungs. She tried to fight back, tried to swing, to scratch, to kick, but she was outnumbered. Laughter echoed in her ears, the sharp snap of her head jerking from another punch. Her body hit the cold floor. Boots kicked into her ribs, her back, her thighs. Her vision blurred. She tasted blood. "Not so tough now, huh?" a voice sneered. She barely registered the words. Then a whistle, sharp, loud. The attack stopped. Chelsea lay there, curled up, coughing, her body trembling. Boots shuffled. The guards were approaching. Too late, too uninterested. "All right, that's enough. Get to your bunks." The crowd dispersed, laughing, muttering, some still smirking at her crumpled form. Chelsea couldn't move. She lay there, face pressed against the grimy concrete, gasping, her entire body screaming in pain. Welcome to hell. Chelsea learned quickly that her name meant nothing here. She wasn't Chelsea McBride, daughter of a police chief, niece of a judge. She was just another inmate in an orange jumpsuit. The guards treated her with thinly veiled contempt. "Look at the princess," one of them sneered when she struggled to lift her food tray with bruised arms. "Not so special anymore, huh?" Another tripped her in the yard, sending her sprawling onto the dirt. Laughter erupted around her. She burned with humiliation. Everywhere she turned, someone was watching, waiting. She couldn't even shower without feeling like she was being hunted. She kept her back against the wall, flinching every time someone moved too close. They wanted her broken, and they were getting closer. Chelsea lasted 3 days before she snapped. She hadn't spoken, hadn't fought back. She had swallowed the humiliation, the pain, the whispers. Then in the cafeteria, someone shoved her. Hard. Her tray clattered to the ground, food spilling everywhere. Laughter. That was it. Before she could stop herself, she swung, her fist connected with bone. The woman, a tattooed brunette with a wicked grin, staggered back, stunned. The cafeteria erupted into chaos. Tables overturned, fists flew. The guards were there in seconds. Chelsea fought like a wild animal. Then came the baton, the sharp crack of it striking her back, her legs, her ribs. Her body crumpled, pain exploding like fireworks behind her eyes. Voices shouting, a knee pressing her face into the floor, the cold bite of cuffs tightening around her wrists. "You think you're tough?" a guard hissed in her ear. "Let's see how tough you are in the hole." Chelsea had never known true isolation until she was thrown into the hole. A small, suffocating box of concrete and shadows. No window, no sound, just darkness. Time stopped existing. She didn't know if it had been hours or days. She paced. She screamed. She banged on the door until her hands bled. No one came. The voices in her head started whispering. "You don't belong here. No one is coming for you. You're nothing now." Chelsea curled into a ball on the floor, her body racked with shivers, with exhaustion, with something worse than fear, hopelessness. She wasn't Chelsea McBride anymore. She was just another prisoner, and for the first time she truly understood what that meant. Chelsea lay on the grimy concrete floor, her breath coming in shallow, pained gasps. Blood dripped from her split lip, mixing with the sweat and filth that coated her skin. Every part of her ached, her ribs, her arms, her face all screaming from the savage beating she had just endured. Laughter still echoed in the air, fading as the crowd dispersed, leaving her broken and humiliated. She wanted to move. She couldn't. Then a shadow loomed over her. Boots stopped inches from her face. A presence she hadn't noticed before, one that seemed to command the space without saying a word. Chelsea forced herself to look up, blinking blood out of her eyes. And then she saw her, Denise Johnson. For a moment, Chelsea's mind refused to accept it. This wasn't possible. Denise wasn't supposed to be here. Denise was supposed to be free. Yet there she stood, taller, stronger, unshaken. Chelsea tried to sneer, to spit out something sharp and venomous, but her body betrayed her. She could barely lift her head. Denise crouched down slowly, resting her elbows on her knees as she studied Chelsea with cool, unreadable eyes. There was no pity there, no sympathy, just control. Chelsea's stomach twisted. "You look surprised," Denise murmured, her voice low, deliberate. Chelsea hated how steady she sounded, how calm, like she had already won. "You thought you were done with me?" Denise tilted her head, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. Chelsea forced herself to swallow the bile rising in her throat. "What the hell are you doing here?" she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. Denise exhaled sharply, almost amused. "Same reason as everyone else. Bad choices, bad luck." Chelsea didn't believe that for a second. Denise didn't move like someone who had been swallowed by the system. She didn't shrink like the others. She stood above them. And that was when Chelsea noticed it the way the other inmates watched Denise. Not with disdain, not with pity, with respect, with fear. Realization crept into Chelsea's bones like ice. Denise wasn't just another prisoner. She was somebody in here. A flicker of movement from the side. The woman who had beaten Chelsea, the one who had kicked her ribs in, who had laughed in her face, stood silent now, waiting for Denise. "That's enough," Denise said, finally standing. And just like that, it was over. The other inmates didn't argue, didn't hesitate. They obeyed. Chelsea's pulse pounded. Denise turned to go, but then she paused. She glanced back, eyes meeting Chelsea's with something hard, something final. "From now on, whether you live or die in here," she leaned in, her voice a whisper of steel, "that's up to me." And with that, she walked away, leaving Chelsea alone with the unbearable truth. She had lost everything. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for supporting us. Where are you watching from? Let us know. Chelsea sat alone in the prison yard, her back pressed against the rough concrete wall, knees pulled up just enough to keep her posture guarded, but not weak. The sun burned against her bruised skin, but the real heat came from the stairs drilling into her from across the yard. She wasn't safe. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She had survived the first few weeks, but barely. The bruises had faded, but the fear had not. Every time she walked past the other inmates, she could feel them watching, waiting. She knew what she was: a rich girl in the wrong place, a privileged outsider thrown into the deep end. And she was drowning. The air around her shifted. She didn't see them at first, she felt them. A presence, heavy, deliberate. Then the shadow of boots against the dirt. "You got a minute?" Chelsea stilled. She looked up slowly, blinking against the sun, and there they were. 3 of them. White, heavily tattooed, built like they had spent years turning rage into muscle. The Aryans. She had seen them before. Everyone had. They controlled the white inmates. They ran the drugs, the contraband, the fights. The guards left them alone. Not because they were afraid, but because they were useful. Chelsea's stomach tightened. "You've been having a rough time," one of them said. Tall, broad, arms lined with inked swastikas and SS bolts. He wasn't offering sympathy, just stating a fact. Chelsea didn't answer. "That can change." The man crouched in front of her, his movements slow, measured like a wolf circling wounded prey. "You want to survive in here?" His voice was calm, almost friendly. "You got to pick a side, and lucky for you, we're willing to help you out." Chelsea knew what this was: an offer, a threat, a promise. She glanced toward the yard where the others were still watching. Not just the white inmates, all of them. Denise sat at a nearby table, arms crossed, gaze locked on the scene unfolding before her. Judging, waiting, knowing. Chelsea forced her voice to stay steady. "And if I say no?" The man's smile barely flickered. "Then you won't last long." Simple. Undeniable. The message was clear. This wasn't a choice. Chelsea exhaled, forcing down the nausea rising in her throat. This was survival, and she wasn't ready to die. She looked up at the man and nodded. "I'm in." The first time it made her sick. The second time it was easier. By the third, she stopped thinking about it. It started with small things carrying messages, standing beside them in the yard, letting the others know she was no longer fair game. Then came the real tests. She knew what was coming before they even said it. Time to earn your keep, Reed told her one evening, his voice filled with amusement. We got a little job for you. They led her to the back of the common area, where a trembling black inmate knelt on the floor. His lip was already split, his nose bleeding. Just a few punches, one of the Aryans said. Show us you belong. Chelsea's stomach clenched. She wanted to run, to scream, to tell them she wasn't this. But the memory of being beaten, being humiliated, being nothing was stronger. She raised her fist, and she swung. Chelsea's knuckles ached from the impact. Her breath came in sharp, ragged gas, adrenaline burning through her veins as she stepped back, watching the inmate crumple to the ground. The Aryans stood around her, their grins wide, their eyes gleaming with something dark approval. Not bad, McBride, Reed said, cracking his neck. You're learning. Chelsea's stomach churned, but she forced herself to stand tall, to keep her expression cold, indifferent. She had done what they wanted. She had proved herself. The woman on the ground, some junkie who had crossed the wrong people, groaned, clutching her ribs. Chelsea didn't look at her. She couldn't. That's enough, Reed said, nudging Chelsea's shoulder as he walked past. For now, just like that, it was over. No one cared. No guards came rushing in. No justice. Just another act of violence buried under 100 others. Chelsea had crossed the line, and there was no going back. It didn't stop there. The Aryans had a system, a hierarchy, a business. And Chelsea? She was useful. She was invisible to the guards, overlooked by the other gangs, which made her the perfect mule. Just a few packs of cigarettes, they said at first. Then it became pills, powder, needles. She knew if she got caught, if she made one wrong move, she wouldn't walk out of this prison alive. But by then, it was too late to turn back. This was survival. This was the choice she had made. And then, one day, Denise saw her. It happened in the yard. Chelsea was mid-exchange, slipping a small wrapped package into another Aryan's hand when she felt the stare. She turned and met Denise's eyes. It wasn't anger she saw, not hatred, just disappointment. Denise stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching like she already knew how this would end. Chelsea's stomach twisted. She forced herself to look away. But Denise wasn't done. She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough so only Chelsea could hear. You think they really got your back? Chelsea's hands curled into fists. They do. Denise let out a soft laugh, not amused. No, they don't. Chelsea glared at her. You don't know anything. Denise's expression stayed calm, steady, certain. I know exactly what you are to them. She leaned in closer, her voice like a blade against Chelsea's skin. A pawn, a tool, a disposable piece on their board. Chelsea's throat felt tight, dry. She wanted to tell Denise she was wrong, that she had control, that she mattered. But Denise just shook her head. I hope you're ready for when they decide they don't need you anymore. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Chelsea alone with the one truth she couldn't escape. Chelsea should have known. She should have seen it coming. She had done everything they asked, delivered packages, thrown punches, kept her mouth shut, but it was never enough. It was never going to be enough. That morning, Reed cornered her in the yard, his smirk as cold as the steel bars that kept them locked inside. Time for you to prove where you really stand, McBride. Chelsea didn't answer. She just waited. Reed's eyes flicked toward the far side of the yard. Denise! Chelsea's stomach dropped. She's been getting too comfortable, he continued, his voice casual, like he was discussing the weather. It's time we remind her where she stands. And you? His smirk widened. You're gonna be the one to do it? The world blurred. Chelsea's mind screamed, no, 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 but she didn't say it. She couldn't. Reed's gaze sharpened. Something wrong? Chelsea's mouth went dry. She couldn't breathe. Denise. Denise, who had saved her once. Denise, who had warned her. Denise, who now sat at a table across the yard, completely unaware that Chelsea had just been given a choice: betray her or be destroyed. You hesitate, you die, one of the Aryans muttered beside her. Chelsea forced her voice steady. I need time, Reed laughed. Time? You don't get time, McBride. You get orders, and you follow them. Chelsea's hands clenched into fists. "Do it today," Reed said, "or don't bother coming back." She didn't do it. She couldn't. And by nightfall, she paid the price. They came for her in the dark. It wasn't loud or dramatic. No guards rushing in. No alarm. Just cold hands dragging her from her bunk, slamming her onto the floor before she could even fight back. Pain exploded in her ribs. A boot connected with her stomach. A fist cracked across her jaw. Over and over and over. Chelsea tried to fight, tried to scream, tried to breathe, but they didn't stop. "You don't get to say no to us, McBride," someone hissed in her ear. Another blow, this one to the side of her head, blinding pain erupting behind her eyes. Then darkness. When she woke up, she was somewhere worse than before. No light, no sound except for the faint, distant drip of a leaking pipe. She was back in solitary confinement. But this time was different. This time they weren't letting her out. They didn't bring food, didn't check on her, didn't care if she lived or died. Time stretched and collapsed in the blackness. Chelsea pressed her back against the cold wall, legs pulled to her chest, head buried in her arms. She wanted to be angry, to be defiant. But she was too tired. She had nothing left. And for the first time since stepping into this prison, Chelsea McBride cried. When they finally pulled her out of the hole, she couldn't even walk. Oh, she was weak, trembling, starving. They dragged her to the common area, shoving her forward until she collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. Chelsea barely registered the sound of a chair scraping back, of footsteps approaching. Then a shadow over her. She lifted her head, her vision still blurry, her body still shaking. Denise. Her face was hard to read, but her eyes. God, her eyes. Chelsea let out a broken, gasping breath, humiliation burning through her. She had nothing left to say. And Denise? Denise just watched, not with pity, not with anger, just disappointment. Chelsea had survived. The beatings, the humiliation, the betrayals, she had endured it all. But as the final day of her sentence arrived, she didn't feel victorious, because deep down, she knew the real punishment was just beginning. The metal door slammed open, and for the first time in 90 days, Chelsea McBride stood on the other side of the prison gates. Freedom, or at least what was left of it. The sun was blinding, burning against her skin after months of cold, artificial prison light. The air smelled different, fresher, cleaner, but somehow it still felt heavy. Her heart pounded. She should feel relieved. She should feel victorious. But instead, she felt nothing. Chelsea stepped forward, her prison-issued shoes scuffing against the cracked pavement. She was holding on to a brown paper bag, her only possessions. A few wrinkled dollar bills, a cheap plastic toothbrush, a bus pass that led nowhere, and no one was waiting for her. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. The screen cracked from the months it had spent in an evidence locker. She hesitated. Then she called the only number that had ever mattered. It rang. Once, twice, then a familiar voice. "Chelsea." Her breath hitched. "Dad, I can't help you." No hesitation, no emotion, just finality. "Dad, please. I have nowhere to go." "You made your choices," he cut in. His voice was firm, steady, merciless. "Now you live with them." A long silence. Then the line went dead. Chelsea's fingers went limp, the phone nearly slipping from her grasp. She had been hoping for this, for some kind of last-minute forgiveness, a lifeline, anything. But he was done with her, and there was no one else to call. Chelsea staggered into the nearest bus stop, slumping onto the metal bench. The city buzzed around her cars, honking, people talking, the world moving on without her. She wasn't part of it anymore. She was an outsider, a stain, a mistake. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through old texts, searching for Trevor. Her last message to him had been months ago. "Babe, please, pick up." She opened his contact and dialed. It rang, but he didn't answer. A voicemail. "The number you have called is no longer in service." Chelsea's stomach twisted. Her eyes flicked to social media. She typed in his name, and there it was. A new profile picture. Trevor smiling, arms wrapped around someone else. Chelsea's chest tightened. She clicked the comments. "Congrats, bro, she's gorgeous. When's the wedding?" Her lungs felt too tight. The world blurred. Trevor was gone, moved on, like she had never existed. She squeezed her phone, staring at the photo until her vision burned. Hours later, Chelsea walked into the first store she could find. A small cafe, warm and buzzing with life. She needed a job. She needed something. The manager, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, glanced up from the counter. "Can I help you?" Chelsea swallowed, forcing a smile. "I'm looking for work." The woman hesitated, sizing her up. "You got experience?" "Yeah, I worked at a—" Then the woman's eyes flicked down, to the tattoos, the Aryan ink still visible on Chelsea's wrist. Her stomach dropped. The manager's expression changed. She knew, and just like that, it was over. "Sorry, we're not hiring." Chelsea tried again, and again, and again. Each time the same thing. A glance at her record, a glance at her tattoos, a glance at her, and then rejection. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, Chelsea had nowhere left to go. She sat on the curb, arms wrapped around herself, watching the city move without her. She thought about going back to the prison. At least there, she had food, a bed, a place to exist. But she wasn't welcome there either. She was nowhere. Chelsea McBride had once been untouchable. Now she was just another ex-con with nowhere to go. And for the first time since walking out of that prison, she wondered, had she ever really been free at all? Chelsea's feet dragged against the cracked sidewalk, her body aching with every step. She had nowhere to go. The exhaustion ran deeper than just her limbs, it was in her bones, in the hollow pit of her stomach, in the way her mind raced with no answers, no solutions, no hope. She had spent the night huddled against the back of a convenience store, trying to block out the bitter cold and the distant sounds of the city moving on without her. She hadn't eaten since yesterday, maybe the day before. Time had blurred, dissolving into an endless stretch of rejection, hunger, and fading strength. She pulled the thin hoodie tighter around herself, her once pristine nails now chipped and dirty, her face gaunt from weeks of living on scraps. Every now and then, she passed a restaurant or a cafe, the warm glow of the inside world so painfully out of reach. No one looked at her, or if they did, they looked away. She had become something people ignored. She kept walking, even when her legs screamed for her to stop, even when she didn't know where she was going. Then something caught her eye. A massive billboard loomed above the intersection, its bright lights cutting through the dull gray of the morning sky. At first, it was just another advertisement, another distraction in a world that had long since stopped belonging to her. But then she saw the face. Familiar. Unmistakable. Chelsea's breath caught in her throat. Denise. Denise Johnson. Her face stretched across the billboard, glowing with confidence and power, her arms crossed, her expression determined. And beneath her name, bold letters spelled out the words that slammed into Chelsea like a freight train. Attorney Denise Johnson, fighting for justice. Chelsea staggered backward, nearly tripping over the curb. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This isn't real. It had to be some kind of sick joke. She stared up, eyes wide, unable to process what she was seeing. Denise, the woman she had attacked, the woman she had tried to destroy. The woman who had walked into that prison and made Chelsea feel smaller than she had ever been in her life. Now she was everywhere, not just surviving, thriving. The very world that had swallowed Chelsea whole had lifted Denise higher. Chelsea felt something twist, deep and sharp. It wasn't anger. It was something worse. Because this was the proof. Proof that Denise had been right. She had been right about everything. Chelsea had once believed she was untouchable, unstoppable, that her name, her family, her privilege would carry her forever. But in the end, it had meant nothing. She had been chewed up, spat out, left to rot. And Denise? She had risen. Chelsea tore her eyes away, shoving her hands deep into the pockets of her hoodie, her fingers trembling. She started walking again, faster this time, as if she could outrun what she had just seen. But the truth followed her. It always would. Chelsea staggered forward, her legs trembling beneath her, the weight of everything crushing down on her all at once. The hunger, the exhaustion, the endless rejections, it all led to this moment. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her vision swimming as the world around her blurred into a chaotic swirl of light and motion. The billboard of Denise's face still burned in her mind, taunting her, mocking her with a cruel, undeniable truth. Denise had won. Chelsea had lost. The realization hit her harder than any fist ever had. Her knees buckled. The sidewalk rushed up to meet her. She collapsed. She barely felt the cold concrete beneath her. The world had faded into numbness. People walked past her, not even pausing. Not a single glance. Not a single offer to help. Because no one saw her anymore. Chelsea McBride, once powerful, once feared, once untouchable, was nothing. She pressed her palms against the pavement, trying to push herself up, but her arms shook too much. She had no strength left. Her body was failing. But worse than that, her mind was breaking. She had spent her whole life believing she was special, that the world would always bend to her, that no matter what she did, no matter who she hurt, she would always come out on top. And yet here she was, on her knees, on the streets, alone. No family, no friends, no future. The girl who had once mocked the weak had become one of them. Her lip quivered, her throat tightening as something foreign, unfamiliar, terrifying clawed its way up from deep inside her. She fought it, she refused. But it came anyway, a sob, raw, ugly, then another, and another, until she was crying openly, gasping for air between choked, desperate sobs. No one cared. Not the father who had once shielded her from consequences. Not the boyfriend who had promised her forever. Not the friends who had laughed at her cruel jokes, fueled her ego, cheered her on when she was at the top. They were all gone. Because Chelsea McBride wasn't important anymore. The world had moved on without her, and for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be nothing. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Chelsea McBride's downfall did not unfold in a single cataclysmic moment. Rather, it was a slow unraveling of everything she had once held dear, shaped by every slight and every act of contempt she had inflicted upon others. She believed her money and her family's influence would shield her from the consequences that ordinary people faced. Arrogance was her armor, and she wielded hate like a weapon. But when she assaulted Denise Johnson, a woman she deemed beneath her, all those illusions began to crack. At first, Chelsea was certain she would walk free. She strutted into the courtroom with her hateful shirt, expecting the judge to be swayed by her last name. Yet Judge Malcolm Graves, unmoved by her entitlement, handed down a 90-day sentence that left her speechless. Her father's influence, her uncle's connections, none of it stopped the clang of the prison gates. She was swallowed by a system she had always believed was for other people. Inside those walls, she was just another inmate in orange. Arrogance became a liability. On her first day, she tasted blood in her mouth as fellow prisoners reminded her that her privileged past held no currency here. The guards ignored her pleas, and her bunkmates eyed her with scorn. But the worst shock came when she saw Denise again. Denise carried herself with a poise that startled Chelsea, as though she were untouchable in a place where everyone else felt caged. Denise didn't tremble or flinch. She simply observed Chelsea, neither gloating nor cowering, leaving Chelsea with a deep sense of shame. In desperation, Chelsea joined a white supremacist gang that demanded total obedience. She delivered contraband, beat down targets they selected, and traded her soul for a shred of protection. Every blow she landed called to mind that original assault on Denise, as if each act of violence replayed her darkest moment. The gang saw her as a pawn, and when she hesitated to attack an inmate, they turned on her. The beatings, the solitary confinement, and the cold echo of her own regrets trapped her in a cycle of desperation. Late at night, she lay awake, replaying every decision that led her to this prison bed, knowing she had chosen hate at every turn. When her sentence ended, she walked out with a paper bag of belongings, expecting at least a flicker of relief. Instead, she found no one waiting. Her father had cut ties, her former boyfriend had moved on. She called old friends who once cheered her every petty cruelty, but they had distanced themselves. Now unemployed and alone, she drifted through a city that had no place for an ex-con with hateful tattoos and a stained reputation. She applied for jobs, but each attempt ended with the same polite rejection once they recognized her name or noticed the ink that marked her past. One day, starving and exhausted, she spotted a towering billboard bearing the determined face of Denise Johnson, now a prominent civil rights attorney. The billboard declared, "Denise Johnson fighting for justice." Seeing Denise's face was like a punch to the gut. The woman she had belittled, the one she had tried to destroy, had risen to a position of respect and power. Denise's calm eyes on that massive sign reminded Chelsea that hate never leads to victory. Chelsea stumbled away, grappling with an emptiness that she had never known. She collapsed on a curb, pressing her head against her knees as the truth settled in. She had lost everything. She was once untouchable, but arrogance had dragged her down into a pit deeper than any prison cell. Her illusions were gone, and the life she had cherished was a distant memory. Alone and hungry, she realized the worst punishment was not prison. It was facing a world that had moved on without her. She had no family support, no job, and no sympathy. She was a cautionary tale, a living testament to the poison of hate. Pride had kept her from seeing the harm she inflicted, but now it was gone, and in its absence she felt only regret. Perhaps if she had chosen empathy instead of cruelty, she might have built something meaningful rather than smashing lives under her heel. But the time for if only had passed. She could not undo the bruises she'd inflicted or the torment she'd caused. Somewhere, Denise was thriving, fighting injustice, championing people who had been knocked down by a system that Chelsea had once used to her advantage. Denise's triumph wasn't about revenge, it was about channeling pain into purpose. Chelsea understood that better than anyone, her own suffering had begun to open her eyes, showing her that arrogance was flimsy scaffolding. Hatred had devoured her from the inside, leaving her empty-handed. She found a ragged piece of cardboard in an alley and used a marker to scrawl a plea for help, standing on a street corner with trembling hands, drawing glances of pity or disgust from strangers. Each day, the city felt bigger, more indifferent, and her place in it smaller and more precarious. Late one evening, she wandered into a shuttered storefront for shelter, huddling in the dark, with only her regret to keep her company. She thought back to her privileged life, the mansion, the fancy cars, the circle of people who once nodded in agreement with everything she said. Now she realized how shallow it all had been. Those people had never cared for her. They only cared about the benefits her name could bring. The moment she lost her power, they vanished. She was left with a battered sense of self, unsure if redemption was even possible. In this spiral of despair, one singular lesson glowed like an ember in her mind. Hatred never brings victory. Justice finds a way. Those words echoed with every bleak sunrise. She had hated Denise, but it hadn't made her stronger. It had led her to the bleakest corners of human cruelty. Meanwhile, Denise had fought for justice, and that path had led her to a billboard overshadowing the city skyline, an emblem of courage. That was the final blow, the undeniable truth that Chelsea could no longer escape. She rose at dawn, determined to face this new reality with whatever scraps of courage she had left. She was done crawling. She took the bus to a community center she'd heard might offer assistance to ex-inmates. The battered interior was nothing like her old life, but the volunteer at the desk offered a cup of coffee and a list of possible housing options. It was a small kindness, but it felt enormous, like a door cracking open. Though the volunteer recognized her from news reports, he didn't recoil. He simply set a job application on the table and told her to fill it out carefully. Tears pricked her eyes at the simple gesture of acceptance, so different from the scorn she'd faced. Chelsea sat there, pen in hand, wrestling with shame and hope. She didn't know if she could rebuild. She didn't know if she deserved to. But she thought of Denise's relentless courage, of how she had been the victim of Chelsea's violence, yet had risen above that cruelty to become a champion of justice. Maybe that was the blueprint. Maybe the only way forward was to acknowledge her darkest chapters while striving to be better than the person she had been. She clung to the conviction that the only real future worth having was one guided by empathy, Her once certain belief that she stood above everyone else had cost her everything she valued: family, love, security, even her own sense of self. She was a living example of how arrogance corrodes from within. Meanwhile, Denise's example showed that resilience and moral conviction have a power that hatred can never match. In the end, Chelsea's story stands as a stark warning. Hate may provide a brief, intoxicating sense of superiority, but it rots you from the inside until nothing remains but regret. And justice, though sometimes delayed, has a way of cutting through illusions and leaving truth in its wake. To anyone willing to listen, Chelsea would offer the message she had learned so painfully. Hatred promises dominance, but delivers destruction. Compassion, justice, and empathy lead to growth and redemption. The old Chelsea would have scoffed at these ideas, laughing in the face of mercy. But the new Chelsea understood that there is no victory in crushing others. The only true triumph is forging a world where dignity and fairness stand above all else. She had once imagined herself at the pinnacle of power, yet the real power belonged to those who fought for justice. Hate had taken her freedom, her pride, and her place in the world. It had not taken her capacity to learn. In that, she found her fragile sense of hope, determined never again to bow to the cruelty that had led her astray. Hatred never leads to victory. Justice always finds a way. Justice cannot be twisted, bought, or silenced. Chelsea McBride thought she was untouchable, but justice found her. Denise Johnson, once her victim, rose above hatred and became a champion for truth. Chelsea lost everything, not just her freedom, but her very identity. Hate never wins. It destroys the one who carries it. If you believe justice always prevails, that no one is above the law, and that truth will rise no matter what, then stand with us. Like and subscribe if you believe that justice cannot be erased. Justice will always find its way. Judge mocks black teen girl's speech, shocked when she destroys the system and makes history. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom groaned open, and a rush of hushed whispers filled the space. Emily Taylor stepped inside, her presence instantly swallowed by the oppressive weight of the room. The scent of old paper, polished oak, and something colder, like anticipation laced with malice, hung in the air. Hundreds of eyes turned to her, some filled with amusement, others with outright hostility. She was just 16, but she was standing here alone, facing a system that had never lost to someone like her. At the center of it all, seated high on his bench, was Judge Harold Carver. His presence was a monument to the old ways, gray-haired, stern-faced, and radiating the authority of a man who had long since decided that justice was a game only certain people were allowed to play. He adjusted his glasses with slow deliberation, his lips curling slightly at the sight of her. Then in a voice dripping with condescension, he said, "Let me get this straight." His fingers drummed against the thick file in front of him before his gaze returned to her, sharp and patronizing. "A high school student is here to argue constitutional law in my courtroom?" Laughter rippled through the audience like the first cracks in a dam. First low, then growing louder, spreading through the rows of suited figures seated behind their gleaming desks. At the defense table, Nancy Whitaker, the school board's lead attorney, exchanged glances with her colleagues, shaking her head in feigned disbelief. She leaned forward, her voice smooth and polished with years of experience. "Miss Taylor, this isn't a high school debate club. Perhaps you've confused this with an extracurricular activity?" More laughter. Emily clenched her fists, nails digging into her palm, but she refused to lower her gaze. She had known this would happen. She had prepared for this moment. And yet, standing here, drowning in the smug amusement of those who had spent their entire lives wielding power like a weapon, she felt the first sharp stab of doubt creep into her chest. The courtroom itself was designed to intimidate. It was grand, towering, a place meant to remind those who entered that justice belonged to the powerful. Dark mahogany walls lined with books that no one like her had ever been allowed to write. Rows of wooden benches filled with reporters eager to document her inevitable failure. The chandeliers above cast a warm glow over the prosecution's table, where Whitaker sat, her expensive suit pristine, her nails meticulously polished. Everything about her screamed control, experience, power. In contrast, Emily stood in a simple navy dress, her hands gripping the podium so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The murmurs around the room continued, a swirling storm of contempt, but she stood her ground. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear, despite the pounding of her heart, "I'm not here for a debate. I'm here for justice." The room fell into momentary silence. It was brief, just a flicker of stillness before Whitaker scoffed, shaking her head. "Justice," she repeated mockingly. "And you believe you, a high school junior, are qualified to define what that means in a court of law?" Emily opened her mouth, but before she could respond, the judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling as though indulging a particularly foolish child. "Miss Taylor," he said, shaking his head, "I admire your enthusiasm. But this courtroom isn't the place for grandstanding. The law is complex. It is not a platform for activism disguised as legal argument." Emily felt her pulse hammering in her ears. She wanted to tell him that she had spent the last 6 months buried in case law, that she had memorized constitutional precedents while her peers were at football games, that she had sacrificed sleep, friendships, and peace of mind because she knew that if she failed here, the system would continue crushing people like her. But she also knew that these men, these polished attorneys with their decades of experience and their inherited seats of power, did not care about any of that. Whitaker pushed back from the table, smoothing her blazer as she rose to her feet. "Your Honor," she said, turning to the judge with a practiced smile, "I move to dismiss this case on the grounds that Miss Taylor lacks standing, lacks expertise, and frankly, lacks any real argument worth hearing." The judge sighed, nodding slightly. "A reasonable request," he mused. Then looking back at Emily, he tilted his head. "Do you have a response, Miss Taylor? Or have we wasted enough time here today?" The words stung like a slap, but Emily straightened her shoulders. "I do, Your Honor," she said, forcing steel into her voice. "I have prepared a legal argument based on constitutional law, case precedent, and civil rights protections. I am not asking for favors. I am asking for my case to be heard, just as it would be if I were represented by an older, white male attorney instead of standing here as a 16-year-old black girl." The murmurs returned, louder this time. A few reporters leaned forward. A flicker of interest sparked in their eyes. Emily saw Whitaker's lips press into a thin line, saw the way her fingers tightened slightly on the papers before her. For the first time, Emily realized she had struck a nerve, but Carver merely sighed again, shaking his head. "Miss Taylor, passion is admirable, but this court deals in facts, not sentiment. Now, unless you have something truly groundbreaking to present." 6 months ago, Emily never imagined she would be standing here, facing a courtroom filled with powerful men who had already decided her fate. Back then, she was just another girl watching the world move against her people, feeling the weight of injustice but believing someone else would fight it. Willow Creek was the kind of town that looked peaceful on the surface, the kind of place where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges and white picket fences, where families attended Sunday service at the old brick church and waved to their neighbors from their porches. But underneath that carefully constructed facade, beneath the quiet hum of small-town life, lay an unspoken truth, one that everyone knew but no one dared to say aloud. Willow Creek was not for everyone. For families like the Taylors, the Mitchells, and every other black family in town, the lines had been drawn long ago. They weren't written down, not explicitly, but they were just as real as any law. There were places they could go and places they could not, schools they could attend and schools that would never let them through the door, no matter how hard they tried. And the brightest among them, the ones who dared to dream beyond the limitations imposed upon them, were the ones who suffered the most. Samantha Mitchell was 10 years old, a little girl with big brown eyes, a wide, hopeful smile, and a mind that burned with curiosity. She loved books, loved to learn, and she was smarter than most kids twice her age. She had been reading since she was 4, solving math problems meant for high schoolers by the time she was 8. Her teachers at Jefferson Elementary had run out of ways to challenge her. "She needs more," they told her parents, their voices edged with something close to apology. "She belongs somewhere she can grow." And there was only one place in Willow Creek where she could grow. Oak Ridge Academy. Oak Ridge was the best school in the district, a private institution disguised as a public one, reserved for the children of doctors, lawyers, and business executives. A place where the curriculum was rigorous, the facilities were state-of-the-art, and the unspoken rule had remained unchanged for decades. Black kids didn't get in. Samantha's parents had done everything right. They filed the paperwork early, met every deadline, provided every necessary document. Her father, Robert Mitchell, had even gone so far as to schedule meetings with the admissions office, presenting Samantha's test scores, her letters of recommendation, every piece of evidence that proved she deserved a spot. They smiled at him, nodded politely, assured him that the process was fair, that every child was given equal consideration. And then, weeks later, when the acceptance letters were sent out, Samantha's name was missing. At first, Robert had assumed there had been a mistake. He had called the office, waited on hold for nearly an hour before finally reaching someone. The voice on the other end of the line had been cold, detached. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell. Unfortunately, Samantha's application did not meet our standards for admission." His stomach twisted. "What standards?" "She scored in the 98th percentile on every assessment. Her teachers wrote glowing recommendations. What exactly was missing?" There was a pause, a brief, uncomfortable silence. And then, "I'm afraid I can't discuss specific admissions decisions, sir. The process is final." Click. Just like that, it was over. Robert had driven straight home, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His wife, Angela, had been waiting at the kitchen table, holding the unopened rejection letter in her hands, as if not opening it would change what was inside. "They didn't even consider her," Robert had said, his voice hollow. "They never were going to." Angela had swallowed hard, blinking back the anger in her eyes. "What do we tell her?" They had tried to soften the blow, tried to explain that sometimes things didn't work out, that there were other schools, other opportunities. But Samantha was too smart for that. She had listened, nodding quietly, her little hands curled into fists in her lap. And then, in a small, broken voice, she had asked the one question they couldn't answer. "Was it because I'm black?" Angela had flinched. Robert had looked away, because they both knew the truth. Emily Taylor had heard the story from her father first. She had been sitting in the living room, flipping through one of his old law books, when she overheard his conversation with Robert. She hadn't meant to listen, but as soon as she heard Samantha's name, she couldn't stop herself. When her father finally hung up, his face was tight with frustration, his hands clenched at his sides. "They didn't even give her a chance," he muttered, shaking his head. Emily felt something hot coil inside her. She had seen this happen before. She had seen it happen to kids in her own neighborhood, kids who were just as smart, just as deserving, but who were turned away with the same empty excuses. "There's no space in the program." The district boundaries changed this year. Your paperwork wasn't processed in time. It was always something, always a reason, always a lie. The rejection letter lay open on the desk like a death sentence. The words, typed in cold, detached legalese, carried the same weight as a judge's gavel slamming down to end a case before it even began. Motion denied. No further appeal. The ink had barely dried. But for Marcus Taylor, the ruling had been set long before the papers had even reached his hands. He sat motionless in his chair, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting shadows across his face, emphasizing the deep lines carved by years of fighting, losing battles. The room smelled of old paper, ink, and the faint trace of coffee gone stale, remnants of the long nights he had spent here, poring over case law, drafting arguments that no one in power ever cared to hear. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, fingers twitching slightly, as if caught between the urge to crumple the letter into nothingness or let it remain as undeniable proof of yet another defeat. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "They didn't even read it," he muttered, his voice low, bitter. His eyes never left the paper in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. Somewhere in the past, reliving every courtroom where he had stood, every judge who had dismissed his words before he could even finish speaking. "They won't even hear us. They never do." Behind him, the floor creaked softly. He knew who it was before she spoke. "Dad?" Emily stood in the doorway, framed by the dim light from the hallway, her face partially obscured by the darkness of the room. She didn't move closer yet. She was waiting, watching, trying to gauge just how broken he was this time. Marcus let out a sharp breath and leaned back in his chair. "It's over." The words sent a chill through her. She had never heard him say that before. Her father was a man who had spent his entire life believing in the fight, in the law, in the idea that truth had power. But now as he sat there, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow, he looked like a man who had finally realized that some fights were never meant to be won. Emily swallowed hard, stepping into the room. "What do you mean it's over?" Marcus let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I mean, the court refused to hear the case. They didn't even bother to look at the evidence. They dismissed it before we could get a foot in the door." He picked up the letter and waved it slightly before tossing it back onto the desk. "They called it procedural, said there wasn't enough precedent to justify a hearing." Emily's jaw tightened. Procedural. She had heard that word before. It was what they always said when they didn't want to admit the truth, when they didn't want to say outright that people like them didn't get to win. Her father exhaled again, rubbing a hand over his face. "I should have known. I should have known they wouldn't let us fight this." The anger in her chest burned hotter. "So what? We just give up." Marcus glanced at her then, his eyes heavy. "Emily, no," she snapped. "You told me the law was supposed to protect us. That justice existed if we fought for it." Her voice shook, but she forced herself to keep going. "Was that a lie?" He flinched slightly as if the words had cut deeper than she intended, but he didn't answer. That was enough of an answer. Something inside her cracked, but instead of despair, it was something sharper. Anger. Determination. If the law wasn't built to protect them, then she would tear it apart and rebuild it herself. She turned sharply, storming out of the room. Marcus called after her, but she didn't stop. She wasn't done yet. Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat at the dining table, surrounded by stacks of legal books, old case files, her father's worn notebooks filled with years of research and failed lawsuits. Her laptop screen glowed in the darkness, illuminating the exhaustion in her eyes, but she didn't stop flipping through pages, scanning documents, searching for something, anything that could give them a way forward. The weight of history pressed against her, suffocating. She read through case after case, each one telling the same story. A black student denied admission, a lawsuit filed, a court refusing to hear it, not enough legal precedent, not strong enough grounds, not worth their time. The pattern was obvious. The system had been designed to keep them out, to bury their voices under mountains of bureaucracy. And her father, he had spent his entire life trying to play by the rules, believing that if he just argued well enough, if he just had the right evidence, they would listen. They never had, and now he was breaking under the weight of it. Emily wasn't going to let them break her too. The clock on the wall ticked, marking the slow creep of dawn. Her fingers ached from flipping pages, her vision blurred from the relentless glow of the screen. She was exhausted, but she kept going. And then, she found it. Her breath caught as she scanned the ruling. A Supreme Court decision, a precedent, a case from decades ago, where a student, just like Samantha, had been denied access to an advanced educational program under the same excuses. Procedural error, not enough space, policy restrictions, but this time someone had fought back, and they had won. Emily sat up straighter, heart hammering against her ribs. She reread the ruling, her mind racing through the implications. The arguments were clear, undeniable. The courts had already ruled on this once. If they had set a precedent, then that meant the system wasn't as airtight as they wanted people to believe. This was it. This was their way in. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed her notebook, scribbling furiously, pulling together pieces, connecting dots. She could build a case around this. She could make them listen. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't even out of high school. But that didn't matter. The truth was on her side. She just had to make them see it. A noise behind her made her turn. Marcus stood in the doorway, watching her with tired, wary eyes. "You're still up?" His voice was hoarse, heavy with exhaustion. She didn't look away. I found something. He frowned slightly, stepping forward. She shoved the file toward him. Read it. Marcus hesitated, then sat down, flipping through the pages. The room was silent except for the rustle of paper, the distant hum of the refrigerator. Emily watched him closely, barely breathing as he scanned the ruling, as his expression shifted from skepticism to something else, something sharper, more focused. When he finally exhaled, it was slow, measured. He set the file down and looked at her. This, he shook his head slightly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. This could work. Emily's pulse quickened. Then we fight. Marcus studied her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then finally something in him shifted. For the first time in a long time, she saw it. Hope. He let out a breath and nodded. All right, he said, voice steadier than before. Let's get to work. A spark ignited in her chest. This wasn't over. Not even close. This was just the beginning. But finding the legal precedent was only the first step. Winning a case wasn't just about having the right argument. It was about proving you were strong enough to stand in the ring with giants and not flinch. Emily knew the fight ahead would be brutal, but she also knew one thing. She couldn't afford to lose. So with the law on her side and determination burning in her chest, she made her decision. The moment Emily announced she was going to sue the school district, the world around her seemed to stop. The weight of the words hung heavy in the air, echoing in the stunned silence of her kitchen. Her father had stared at her as if she had spoken in a language he couldn't understand. Her mother had frozen, dish towel clenched in her hands, a deep crease forming between her brows. And then, all at once, the room had erupted. You can't be serious, her father had said, voice tight, weary. Emily, do you even understand what you're saying? But she had understood perfectly. She had spent days, nights, weeks reading, learning, dissecting legal arguments, poring over case law until the words blurred together. And in all that time, she had come to one undeniable conclusion. If no one else would fight, then she had to. They're wrong, she had said, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. And we can prove it. Her father had sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. Emily, I've been trying to prove it my entire career. You think one lawsuit is going to change anything? You didn't have this, she shot back, shoving the file toward him. A precedent, a case that won. If they ruled in favor of that student, then the law is on our side. But Marcus only shook his head, his expression unreadable. Even if you're right, the courts aren't. They'll shut you down before you get a chance to speak. Her mother, silent up until now, finally spoke. Honey, she said, voice softer but just as firm, this is dangerous. I know, Emily said, but it's more dangerous if we do nothing. Word spread quickly. The town buzzed with disbelief, whispers traveling through grocery store aisles, church pews, and school hallways. Did you hear? The Taylor girl is suing the school. A high schooler? What is she thinking? They'll eat her alive. Some called her brave. Others called her foolish. And some, her classmates, her so-called friends, called her worse. You actually think you're going to win? Maya, her best friend since kindergarten, had asked, incredulous. Emily, this is Oak Ridge. It doesn't matter what's fair. They make the rules. They make the rule, Emily had replied, but that doesn't mean they can't be broken. Maya had just shaken her head, disappointment clouding her features. You're going to lose everything. Colleges won't touch you after this. They'll label you a troublemaker. Emily had wanted to care, but something in her had shifted. The more people doubted her, the more determined she became. It was time to prepare for battle. Every night, the living room transformed into a courtroom. The coffee table became the judge's bench, stacks of law books piled high. The worn-out couch acted as the jury box, empty save for the ghost of doubt that haunted her father's eyes. And at the center of it all was Emily, standing behind a rickety folding chair that served as her podium, staring down her fiercest opponent, Marcus Taylor. Her father took on every role, judge, jury, prosecution, defense. And every night, he tore her arguments apart. This is weak, he snapped, tossing her notes onto the table. If I were the school's attorney, I'd rip you to shreds in under a minute. Emily gritted her teeth, snatching up her papers. Then I'll make it stronger. You're quoting precedent, but do you actually understand it? He pressed. Explain the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education without reading from your notes. Emily opened her mouth, then hesitated. Marcus smirked. Exactly. You don't just need to memorize the law, Emily. You need to own it. You need to anticipate every counter-argument before they even make it. If you freeze in that courtroom, they'll eat you alive. Emily clenched her jaw, standing straighter. Then let's go again. And they did. Night after night, they battled until exhaustion blurred the lines between practice and reality. Marcus played the opposition with ruthless precision, throwing every insult, every sneer, every attempt to discredit her that the real attorneys would. This is a joke, Your Honor, he spat one night, playing the part of a condescending school attorney. She's just a child. She doesn't belong here. Emily's fist curled at her sides. The law doesn't care how old I am, she shot back. It cares about justice. He leaned in, eyes sharp. Oh? And what makes you think you can win? You're alone. No legal team, no experience. Just a naive little girl with a folder full of theories. Emily's heart pounded, her breath short, but she refused to falter. I have facts. I have the law. And I have something none of you have. Truth. Marcus let the silence stretch, watching her. Then, without warning, he slammed his hand against the table, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. Emily flinched but held her ground. Marcus exhaled, leaning back. For the first time in weeks, something in his expression changed. Approval. You're getting there, he admitted, but you're not ready yet. And so they continued. She studied harder. She researched deeper. She lived and breathed case law, scouring every angle, every loophole, every single precedent that could give her an edge. She practiced in the mirror, memorizing her responses, training herself not to show doubt. She argued her case at the dinner table, forcing her parents into debates over policy and discrimination until they had no choice but to admit she was making sense. Slowly, painfully, she got better. One night after hours of relentless drilling, her father sat back in his chair, watching her with a strange expression. You really think you can do this? He asked. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. I know I can. Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then with a quiet sigh, he nodded. Then let's make them listen. Something in Emily's chest tightened. He hadn't just said you, he had said we. For the first time since this had started, she wasn't alone. And that changed everything. The first article appeared in the local paper, small, almost forgettable, tucked between news about the mayor's latest initiative and a high school football victory. Local teen challenges school district over alleged discrimination. The headline was cautious, the language restrained, as if the journalist wasn't sure whether to take Emily seriously or treat her as a novelty. But it didn't take long for the story to grow. By the next morning, more outlets had picked it up. High school student takes on education system, a fight for justice? The words spread like wildfire. Soon, reporters were calling, emails flooded in, and camera crews showed up outside the school gates, their lenses trained on the girl who had dared to step into a battle meant for seasoned lawyers and civil rights organizations. At first, Emily hadn't expected it to be this big. She had thought naively that maybe her case would be heard in quiet courtrooms, that her fight would be fought in legal documents and debates behind closed doors. But now the world was watching. She walked the hallways of Jefferson High with 100 pairs of eyes following her, their stares a mixture of admiration, disbelief, and quiet resentment. Some students whispered as she passed, their voices just low enough to sting. She really thinks she can win. She's just embarrassing herself. She's going to regret this. Even the teachers didn't know what to do with her. Some smiled at her in the way adults do when they think a child doesn't understand the weight of the battle they're fighting. Others avoided her completely, as if acknowledging her would drag them into a war they wanted no part of. And then came the backlash. It started subtly. Parents complaining at school board meetings, news anchors questioning whether she was being manipulated by outside forces. But soon it turned uglier. One night, as Emily sat at the kitchen table, flipping through legal notes with her father, her mother walked in, her face pale as she held out an envelope. No stamp, no return address, just her name scrawled across the front in uneven, jagged letters. Emily took it, her fingers steady even as something cold settled in her stomach. She tore it open, pulled out the single sheet of paper, and read, "Stop now, before it's too late." Her breath caught. Marcus was already reaching for the letter, his expression darkening as he scanned the words. Angela stood frozen, hands clenched, her eyes darting between them. "What the hell is this?" Marcus muttered, gripping the page like he wanted to crush it. Angela's voice trembled. "It was in the mailbox when I got home. No name, no postage." Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep her voice even. "It's just a scare tactic." Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing his hand down his face. "This isn't just some schoolyard prank, Emily. This is a threat." "So what?" she shot back, her pulse pounding. "We stopped fighting because someone wrote a few words on a piece of paper?" Angela's voice was tight. "We don't know who sent it. We don't know what they're capable of." But Emily knew fear was exactly what they wanted. She stood straighter, staring at the paper again. The letters were bold, blocky, written in heavy strokes like the writer had pressed too hard, as if trying to make sure the words carried weight. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. She met her father's gaze. "They wouldn't be scared if we weren't a threat." Marcus hesitated, then let out a slow breath, setting the letter down carefully. His face was unreadable, but something flickered behind his eyes. Something she had seen in the courtroom before, when an opposing attorney had underestimated him. "You're right," he finally said, "but that doesn't mean we get careless." Angela let out a quiet sigh, shaking her head. "We should go to the police," Marcus scoffed. "And tell them what? That someone's trying to intimidate us because my daughter wants justice? They'll throw it in a pile with every other case they don't bother solving." Emily knew he was right. If the law had worked the way it was supposed to, she wouldn't be fighting this battle in the first place. That night she lay awake, the note sitting on her desk like a ghost in the darkness. She wasn't naive. She had always known there would be pushback, but seeing it, feeling the weight of it in her hands, made it real in a way she hadn't been prepared for. Her phone buzzed beside her, a text from an unknown number. "Drop the case. This is your last chance." A chill ran down her spine. She stared at the screen for a long moment before typing her response. "No." Then she turned off her phone, exhaled slowly, and closed her eyes. They wanted her to be afraid. They wanted her to back down. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. She had come too far, fought too hard to walk away now. And so, when the day of the hearing arrived, Emily stepped into that courtroom ready to make them listen. The courtroom was a battlefield, and Emily Taylor stood at its center, unarmed. The walls loomed high, lined with rows of dark mahogany bookshelves filled with laws that had never protected people like her. The air was thick with expectation, the tension crackling like a storm about to break. She could feel it pressing against her skin, suffocating, closing in. But she stood tall, fingers gripping the edges of the podium as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The opposing attorney, Richard Daniels, rose from his seat, adjusting his expensive cufflinks as he took slow, measured steps toward the judge. He didn't even look at Emily as he spoke. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this case is a waste of the court's time." His voice was smooth, polished from years of dismantling cases before they even had a chance to breathe. "We are here because a child has convinced herself that she belongs in a legal setting, but the law does not bend to amateur theatrics." A murmur spread through the courtroom like a ripple of amusement. Daniels turned then, finally looking at Emily, his eyes sharp with condescension. "Miss Taylor is not an attorney. She has no legal expertise, no training, and no business arguing in this courtroom." He gave a small, patronizing smile. "Frankly, I'm not sure if she understands the weight of what she's doing." Laughter, light but cutting, rose from the defense table. Emily's nails dug into her palm. She forced herself to steady her breath. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Daniels." Her voice was strong, but she could hear the tremor beneath it. "The law exists to protect every citizen, not just the ones who can afford a degree." Daniels raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "And yet, Miss Taylor, Your case rests on shaky ground. Tell me, do you truly believe that standing here and throwing around passionate rhetoric is enough? That you, without any experience, without a legal team, can overturn a system that has stood for decades? Emily opened her mouth, but he wasn't done. You are here, Miss Taylor, not because your argument is sound, but because you crave attention. His tone was sharp now, his words precise, meant to wound. This is not about justice. This is about a girl who wants to play hero in a fight she doesn't understand. The words hit like a slap. Emily's vision blurred at the edges, the room swaying slightly as the weight of every doubt, every whispered insult, every warning she had ignored came crashing down at once. The judge cleared his throat, an air of impatience clinging to him as he turned to Emily. Miss Taylor, do you have anything substantial to counter the motion for dismissal? This was her moment. This was where she was supposed to prove them wrong. She gripped the podium tighter, her prepared arguments flashing through her mind. But they felt like dust, slipping through her fingers. The weight of every stare bore down on her, waiting, daring her to fail. Seconds stretched into eternity, and then the gavel came down. This case lacks sufficient legal standing, the judge declared, his voice final, cutting through the room like the crack of a whip. The motion to dismiss is granted. The case is thrown out. Silence, then a shuffle of movement, the creak of wooden benches as people began to rise, the whispers of satisfaction and amusement. Emily couldn't move. The words rang in her ears over and over. Case dismissed. Case dismissed. Case dismissed. Her hands fell from the podium, numb. Daniel smirked, closing his briefcase with a decisive snap. Whitaker, his co-counsel, stood gracefully, adjusting her blazer as if she had never doubted this outcome for a second. Emily felt the pressure of the moment crush her, felt the courtroom blur around her as she realized she had lost. Not just lost. She had been humiliated. By the time she stepped outside, the cold air hit her like a slap. She had barely made it down the courthouse steps before the cameras swarmed. Emily, do you have a comment on the judge's ruling? Do you still believe you had a case? Will you be filing an appeal? She couldn't answer. Her throat was too tight. She walked blindly, past the reporters, past the murmuring bystanders, past the echoes of laughter still ringing in her ears. By the time she reached home, her legs were shaking. She barely made it to her room before collapsing onto the bed, curling in on herself as the weight of failure crushed her completely. She had been so sure she could stand against them, so sure the truth would be enough. But it wasn't. They hadn't even let her fight. They had silenced her before she could even speak. Tears burned hot against her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. I was wrong. I was never good enough. I should have listened. I should have known. She had fought so hard. And for what? To be laughed at? To be dismissed like she was nothing? A soft knock at the door. She didn't answer. The door creaked open anyway, and a familiar weight settled beside her on the bed. For a long time, her father didn't speak. He simply sat there, quiet, steady. Then finally, they wanted you to quit. His voice was low, calm, but there was something unbreakable in it. Emily didn't lift her head. And they won. Marcus let out a slow breath. Did they? She squeezed her eyes shut. I lost. No, he said. You were denied. Emily frowned, opening her eyes. What's the difference? Her father sighed, running a hand over his face. The difference is that they never wanted to hear you in the first place. They didn't beat you, Emily. They silenced you. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. His eyes were tired, but they still burned with something she had seen in him all her life. Determination. They want you to give up, he continued. That's how they win. Not by arguing against you, not by proving you wrong, but by making you walk away. Emily swallowed hard. And if I don't? Marcus gave a small, tired smile. Then they'll have to listen. She stared at him for a long time, the words settling into her bones, anchoring her. The fight wasn't over. She had lost a battle. But the war? The war was just beginning. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. But defeat wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The courtroom had silenced her, but the truth was still out there. Buried beneath years of deception, she just had to find it. And then late one night, the phone rang in the dead of night. The sharp, jarring sound cut through the silence like a knife, pulling Emily from the restless haze of her thoughts. She had been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the humiliation of the courtroom over and over again. The words still echoed in her skull. This case lacks standing. Motion to dismiss granted. It didn't matter how much she had prepared. It didn't matter that she was right. They had shut her down before she even had a chance to fight. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, the glow of the screen illuminating a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, pulse quickening. She answered. At first there was only breathing, uneven, hesitant, as if the person on the other end was deciding whether or not to speak. Then a voice, low, urgent. I have something you need to hear. Emily sat up, heart pounding. Who is this? I work for the district, the voice said. I shouldn't be calling you, but after what they did, after what they said in court, I couldn't stay quiet. Her grip on the phone tightened. What are you talking about? A pause, then, they lied. A cold wave of dread washed over her. The voice continued, each word laced with something heavy, something dangerous. The admissions process, the rejection letters, the school board, they manipulate everything. They've been keeping black students out of Oak Ridge for years, fabricating reasons to deny them entry. They change zoning laws, forge wait lists, falsify enrollment records. And when that's not enough, they lose applications. It's not incompetence. It's not a mistake. It's deliberate. Emily's breath caught. She had suspected it. Everyone had. But this wasn't just systemic bias. This was criminal. Her mind raced. Do you have proof? The voice hesitated. Then lower now, almost a whisper. I have recordings. Emily froze. The line crackled slightly and then she heard it. A file being played. At first static. Then voices. Familiar ones. Can't risk it. If we let them in, even a few of them, it opens the door for the rest. Emily's stomach twisted. Another voice. Sharper. Cold. Then we make sure they don't get in. A pause. How? We do what we've always done. We find a reason, a clerical error, a policy adjustment. If that doesn't work, we lose the application. We keep our numbers clean. Silence, then the final blow. We have to stop them by any means necessary. The audio cut off. Emily sat there gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The room around her felt smaller, the walls pressing in. This wasn't speculation anymore. This wasn't just a fight against an unfair system. This was a conspiracy. She forced herself to speak, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Who was that? You know who, the voice said. The board, the district attorneys, the same people who sat across from you in court and laughed when the judge threw your case out. Emily swallowed hard. The courtroom had never been a fair fight. It had been rigged from the start. She clenched her jaw, her pulse thundering. I need those recordings. The voice hesitated. I can get them to you, but you need to be careful. If they find out someone leaked this, I don't care. She cut him off, fire rising in her chest. They think they can shut me up. They think they can bury this. She exhaled, steadying herself. They're wrong. A pause, then quietly. I'll be in touch. The line went dead. Emily sat in the darkness, the weight of what she had just heard settling deep into her bones. She had been fighting for fairness, fighting for Samantha, fighting for every kid like her who had been told no for reasons no one would admit. But this wasn't just about education anymore. This was corruption. This was a cover-up. This was war. The news broke like a thunderclap. Department of Justice opens federal investigation into discriminatory school admissions practices. The headline flashed across television screens, filled the front pages of newspapers, dominated social media feeds. What had started as a dismissed lawsuit, a case thrown out before it could even be heard, had now spiraled into something far beyond the control of those who had tried to bury it. The U.S. government had stepped in, and now the people who had smirked in the courtroom, who had dismissed Emily Taylor as nothing more than a naive child, were scrambling to protect themselves. Inside the school district offices, the atmosphere had turned from smug certainty to full-blown panic. Phone lines buzzed with frantic calls. Lawyers were summoned, meetings were hastily scheduled and then canceled just as quickly, replaced by private discussions held behind closed doors. The board members who had once spoken with such confidence about the integrity of their system were now whispering in hushed voices, their faces pale as they read through the subpoenas arriving at their desks. Richard Daniels, the district's chief legal counsel, sat in his office, his fingers drumming against the desk, his usual polished demeanor unraveling by the second. The words on the official DOJ letter in front of him seemed to pulse with accusation. The United States Department of Justice is hereby opening a formal investigation into allegations of systemic discrimination within the Oak Ridge School District. His throat felt dry. His assistant stood frozen in the doorway, her voice barely above a whisper. The Attorney General's office is on the line. They want a statement. Daniels clenched his jaw. A statement? What was he supposed to say? That they had been caught? That everything they had worked to keep hidden had come crashing down because of a teenage girl who refused to back down? Tell them I'll call back. The assistant hesitated. Sir, they said they won't wait. Daniels exhaled sharply. He could feel the walls closing in. Across town, Nancy Whitaker, the district's lead attorney, paced her office. Phone pressed against her ear as she listened to yet another frantic board member, demanding to know what the hell was happening. You told us this would go away, the voice on the other end snapped. You told us she was a child, an amateur, that we didn't have to worry. Whitaker pinched the bridge of her nose. I thought that was the case, until someone leaked those damn recordings. The recordings. The moment they had surfaced, everything had changed. Those words, we have to stop them, by any means necessary, had detonated like a bomb, sending shock waves through the entire system. The very people who had insisted they were operating within the bounds of the law, who had dismissed every accusation of discrimination as baseless, had been caught on tape admitting to the truth. And now they weren't just facing lawsuits, they were facing prison. FBI agents arrived in unmarked cars, their presence a silent but undeniable force. Computers were confiscated, documents were seized. A quiet but deadly storm had descended on the offices of the Oak Ridge School District, and the people who had once wielded power so effortlessly were now being dragged under by the weight of their own corruption. Emily watched it all unfold from a distance, standing outside the courthouse where, just weeks ago, she had been humiliated, laughed at, dismissed like she was nothing. But she wasn't nothing. She had made them listen. She had forced the most powerful system in the country to acknowledge what so many had tried to ignore. And now those who had mocked her were the ones trembling. The battle wasn't over. The fight wasn't won. But the tide had turned. For the first time, they were afraid. The investigation had shattered the system's walls, exposing the corruption that had thrived in the shadows for decades. But uncovering the truth was only the beginning. Justice demanded more than just headlines and public outrage. It needed consequences. And as the courtroom filled once again, this time with the weight of undeniable evidence, those who had once wielded power with impunity were about to face the reckoning they never saw coming. The courtroom was silent, but the air was electric. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone inside. The lawyers, the press, the officials who had once believed they were untouchable. But no one felt it more than the man standing at the defense table, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. Richard Daniels, the district's chief legal counsel, had spent his entire career bending the system to his will, ensuring that people like Emily never got far enough to challenge him. But today, he wasn't the one in control. The gavel struck. Mr. Daniels, Judge Carver said, his voice even but firm, stand up. Daniels hesitated, his fingers tightening against the table's edge, as if he could hold on to his power if he just gripped hard enough. But there was no escape. Stand up, the judge repeated. Slowly, reluctantly, Daniels rose to his feet. His suit, always pristine, now seemed to hang off him. His once confident posture slumped under the weight of what was about to happen. Across the room, two federal agents stepped forward. Emily watched as they approached, her heart pounding in her chest. "Richard Daniels," one of them said, voice clear and unwavering. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and multiple violations of civil rights law." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Daniels' face paled, his jaw clenched, his mind clearly scrambling for a way out. "This is ridiculous," he spat, his voice breaking. "I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Emily spoke now, stepping forward. "Your job was to keep students like me out of Oak Ridge. Your job was to silence us, to bury our futures under fake paperwork and legal loopholes." Daniels turned to her, his lips curling into a sneer, even as the agents pulled his arms behind his back. "You think you won?" he hissed. "You think this changes anything?" Emily met his glare without flinching. "I don't think I won, Mr. Daniels. I know I did." The sharp click of handcuffs snapped through the room. Daniels' face twisted with rage, but it was useless now. The system he had manipulated for so long had finally turned against him. As the agents led him toward the exit, Emily caught a glimpse of Nancy Whitaker standing by the defense table, her expression unreadable. For weeks, Whitaker had been Daniels' closest ally, fighting to keep the case buried, dismissing every argument Emily had made. But now there was no fight left in her. She reached for her briefcase, hands steady despite the chaos around her. And then, without a word, she turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, voice clipped but firm, "I am withdrawing as lead counsel for the defense." The courtroom exploded into murmurs. Judge Carver raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure, Ms. Whitaker?" She nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor, effective immediately." Emily watched as Whitaker gathered her papers, avoiding eye contact with Daniels as she stepped away. For the first time, the woman who had once laughed at Emily's case looked defeated. Daniels let out a bitter laugh as he was pulled toward the exit. "Coward!" he spat under his breath. Whitaker didn't respond. She just walked out, disappearing through the side door like she had never been there at all. And just like that, the people who had stood against Emily had crumbled. The system had been built to keep people like her down, to make sure that students like Samantha never had a chance. But today it had been forced to answer for its crimes. Emily exhaled slowly, then turned back toward the judge. "Miss Taylor," he said, his tone less condescending than it had been at the start of all this. "Do you have any final remarks before I issue my ruling?" She stepped forward, standing in the very spot where, just weeks ago, she had been dismissed and humiliated. But today, she wasn't just a girl standing alone against the system. She was the voice of every student who had ever been told no. She let the silence stretch for a moment, then lifted her chin. "If we don't fight today," she said, her voice strong, unshaken, "who will fight tomorrow?" The words hung in the air, pressing against every soul in the room. And this time, no one dared to interrupt her. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The chamber was silent, yet the air crackled with anticipation. Every seat in the gallery was filled, lawmakers sitting upright, their faces unreadable as they stared toward the podium. The weight of history pressed down on the room, a slow, suffocating tension that had been building for months. Emily Taylor sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the quiet murmurs around her. She had stood in courtrooms, faced down some of the most powerful people in the system, fought against a machine designed to crush her. But this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every student who had ever been locked out of a future they deserved. Across the chamber, the Speaker of the House adjusted the microphone. The rustling of papers ceased, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. Then finally, "We now move to vote on Bill 327, also known as the Emily Taylor Educational Equity Act." Emily inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening. The bill, the law that, just a year ago would have been impossible. A law that would make sure no student was ever denied an education because of the color of their skin, because of where they lived, because of the silent, insidious barriers that had existed for generations. She had fought for this moment, and now it was here. The clerk stepped forward. The vote will now commence. A hush fell over the chamber. The first vote was cast, then the second, then the third. Each name called, each response recorded, the tally shifting before her eyes. Emily barely breathed. She had faced so many obstacles, so many moments where it seemed like the system would win. The courtroom that had dismissed her, the school board that had tried to silence her, the threats, the humiliation, the losses. But none of it had stopped her. And now the system, the same system that had once turned its back on her, was deciding whether or not to acknowledge the fight she had waged. One by one, the votes came in. Yes, yes, no, yes, yes, yes. The tension in the room thickened. Emily's father sat beside her, his expression unreadable, but she could feel the tension in his posture. He had fought battles like this before. He knew how easily power could shift, how fragile a victory could be. The final votes rolled in. Then, the gavel struck. The bill has passed. For a moment, Emily didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, the words hit her like a tidal wave. It had passed. It had passed. The room erupted. Applause, cheers, the sound of history being written in real time. Emily felt the breath leave her lungs, felt the weight of it all crash into her at once. Her name, her fight, was now part of the law. Emily Law had been born. She had won. But more importantly, so had every student who would come after her. The world didn't change overnight. Emily knew that. She had fought too long, endured too much, to believe that one victory could undo generations of injustice. But something was different now. She could see it in the schools, in the classrooms, in the faces of the students who had once been told no and were now finally hearing yes. It was in the textbooks, no longer outdated, no longer crumbling at the edges like forgotten relics of a system that had never cared. It was in the teachers, new hires, more diverse, more determined, pushing students forward instead of letting them slip through the cracks. And most of all, it was in the students themselves. They walked the halls of Oak Ridge Academy now, Black students, Latino students, students who had been pushed aside for so long that they had stopped believing a place like this could ever belong to them. Now they sat in the same classrooms as those who had once been handed every advantage. Now they had a shot, a real one. Emily saw it firsthand when she visited Jefferson Elementary. She hadn't planned on stopping by, hadn't thought she'd have the time, but something pulled her there. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was something deeper. The school looked the same as she remembered. Same faded brick walls, same squeaky doors, same old swings that groaned under the weight of time. But there was something different, something she could feel in the air. Hope. As she walked through the halls, teachers smiled at her. Some nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Others simply watched as if trying to match the girl in the headlines with the young woman walking their floors. Then a small voice called out behind her, "Excuse me." Emily turned. A little girl, no older than 10, stood in the hallway, clutching her backpack straps tightly. Her bright eyes were filled with something Emily recognized instantly: determination. "You're Emily Taylor, right?" Emily knelt slightly so they were eye level. "I am." The girl's face lit up. "Because of you, my school is better." Emily felt something tighten in her chest. She had spent so long fighting, so long pushing forward, that she had barely stopped to see what had truly changed. But here it was, not in courtrooms, not in legal battles. In this little girl, standing before her, knowing she belonged. Emily smiled, her voice steady. "And because of you," she said softly, "it will keep getting better." Emily stood outside, the cool night air brushing against her skin as she looked up at the endless stretch of sky. The stars burned bright, distant, and untouchable, yet constant. A reminder that no matter how dark the night seemed, light always found a way through. She had won. The law had passed. The people who had tried to silence her had fallen. The children who had once been locked out of opportunity now walked through open doors. But even as she stood there, feeling the weight of everything she had fought for, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The fight wasn't over. Injustice didn't vanish because of one victory. Corruption didn't crumble overnight. There would always be those who tried to rewrite history, who tried to twist laws in their favor, who found new ways to shut people out. Emily knew that, and she also knew this. She wouldn't stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. Because if she had given up after her first defeat, none of this would have happened. If she had let the fear, the threats, the humiliation break her, nothing would have changed. And if she stopped now, someone else would be forced to start all over again. She clenched her fists, inhaling deeply, letting the fire in her chest burn hotter. She wouldn't stop. Because there were still voices waiting to be heard. There were still walls left to tear down. There were still people in power who needed to be held accountable. And if she had learned anything through this journey, it was that one person could make a difference. She turned to the camera, eyes fierce, voice steady. This isn't just my fight. It never was. This is about justice, about making sure no one else has to go through what we did. And that fight doesn't end just because we've won one battle. She took a step closer, the intensity in her gaze unwavering. So if you believe in what we're fighting for, if you believe in justice, in truth, in standing up when the system tells you to sit down, then don't let this be the end. Her voice sharpened, filled with conviction. Like, share, subscribe, spread this message, because the more people who see this, the louder our voices become. And if enough of us stand together, she lifted her chin, a small, knowing smile forming. They can't ignore us anymore. The screen faded to black, but the fight continued. Justice is not a given. It is not something handed down by those in power. It is something that must be fought for, demanded, and defended, again and again by those brave enough to stand up when the system tells them to sit down. Emily's story is not just her own. It is the story of every child who has been told they are not good enough, of every family who has been denied a fair chance, of every voice that has been silenced before it could even be heard. She fought because she had no other choice. Because if she didn't, who would? But her battle was only one chapter in a war that is far from over. Corruption does not disappear just because the light has been shined on it. Those who abuse power do not simply step aside when exposed. They regroup. They find new ways to push people like Emily down. They rewrite the rules, move the goalposts, and wait for the world to stop paying attention. We can't let that happen. This fight is bigger than one girl, bigger than one courtroom, bigger than one law. This is about justice for all of us. This is about making sure that no one else has to go through what Emily did, that no child is ever denied their future because of where they come from or what they look like, that the system built to protect us actually does. But for that to happen, people need to care. People need to listen. People need to act. So if you believe in this fight, if you believe in justice, in truth, in standing up when the world tries to keep you down, then make your voice heard. Like, share, subscribe, spread this message. Because the more people who see this, the harder it becomes for those in power to pretend we don't exist. Emily stood up. Now the question is, will you?